Hello everyone and welcome to Handmade Hero, the show where we code a complete game live on stream and have an increasingly baller profiler. Which, to be completely honest with you, don't really remember what we're going to do today, but I think it was buttons. So I think we're going to do that today. Today is day 264. If you want to follow along at home, day 263 source code is what you want to start with. I'm going to go ahead and jump into it because I think what we're supposed to do today is buttons. And there's not a lot of mystery in how to make a button, so let's have at it. Here's where we left off. 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 We left off with our profiler. We were putting the pro back into profiler, if I do say so myself. We left off in a situation where our profiler was looking pretty darn snazzy, and we could do some things that were kind of awesome, such as saying that we wanted to, take a look at this particular thing that was happening in the game and say, like, okay, here's some crazy number of events or something that's all happening in here, and we could just go ahead and say, you know what, why don't you just stop for a second and let me, pause the debug info and kind of go around and see for any given frame what the breakdown of the profile actually was, right? So that's pretty awesome that we can freeze the profiler and do all this investigation. We can do drilling down like so, right? But we have some stuff that's kind of a little bit janky at this point, which is that once I drill down, I can't get back. I can't say go back to the previous thing that you were viewing, right? Or up one level in the profile, right? I can't do that. I can't restart, right? So now that we're going in here, I have no actual way of ever adjusting anything at all. So I basically can't do anything, right? And the reason that I can't do anything is because we have no way of putting buttons into the profiler or controls that control what's going on. So that's what I need to get started with today. I need to also, we had sort of did some testing with low memory in the debugger, and we probably don't want to keep that going. So if you remember, we had a thing here where we did we used 8 megabytes for the debug back buffer as a test to make sure the recycling worked. And we don't really want to do that. We want to be able to have enough memory to store a significant portion of the frames. So I'm going to go ahead and switch it back. So here you can see we've got plenty of memory now. In fact, we have 83 megs left over. I could reduce it even more than that, but we might as well leave plenty of room. And so we can keep 256 frames back and still have a healthy sort of amount of room remaining in our debug system, which is what we want. So that's really what's happening there. It's kind of weird to see those things fade in and out like that. Anyway. So what I need to do now is I need to sort of add more debug controls here besides just this, like a play and a pause button and things like that would be nice, as well as some things, excuse me, as well as some things for controlling the profile view a little bit more. For example, one thing that might be nice is to be able to zoom in and out or pan on it or something like this. And another thing that might be nice would be to have that back button and some other buttons that could switch. We made that debug sort of percentage, like per frame percentage view, and we don't have any way right now of bringing that back up. So all of that stuff would just is stuff that we could be doing right now, and we can't because we don't have any way to interact. So that's what I'm going to focus on today, is just adding the ability to have those buttons. So as you know, when we have, when we're sort of working with the debug system, we kind of had this idea of getting a fair bit of leverage, since it's just a debug system, a fair bit of leverage out of a fairly small number of things. So for example, in our interface code, right, let me jump to here. In our interface code, we'll just throw something in here like a, frame slider or whatever, and then that just goes into the debug stream like everything else. We don't have to write any new code to handle it or anything. And then on the other side, it just gets picked up and goes, oh, okay, you want a frame slider, put a frame slider in here. So what I should be able to do here is add some of these features, right, so that they're all kind of so that I can add the kinds of controls that I want and have them be usable, right? Now, there's a couple different things here. One is that I may want to add, I mean, in some sense, I guess, I don't know that I really need to add them in here in the sense that if we know we always want the frame slider to have like the play and pause stuff on it, I can just include it in the drawing of that. And same thing with the thread interval graph. So I suppose maybe the easiest thing to do here, at least at first, is to focus on how do I take an existing element that just wants to have some buttons associated with it and add those in there. So you can see here, like when we get to the thread interval graph, here is the thing that draws it. It says here's how big it's going to be, and then it sort of puts that. It draws it in here. And what I want to do, right, is in here I want to be able to do something which can draw either of these two, right? I'd like to do something where I can say, yeah, I want my graph to have like a type, and maybe I even do this where I say switch graph type. And then in here, I've got, there's the, there's a thread profile or a debug graph thread profile or something. And then here, there's also a debug graph frame bars. Right, I could pretty easily do something like this. Unfortunately, I don't know what sitch is. Let's put that on. Unfortunately, I think that might be making things a little too redundant. So what I'm thinking might be a more interesting option, right, would be to just do something like this. If we actually make it be, up at this level of type specificity, there's nothing that says I can't have this thing change its type dynamically, right? I can just set this type field, and then it sets a new type field. And that way I can share this code, and still, I can have this type be mutable by the user if the user would like to view this particular profile in a different way. But I can also have the person who's making the debug call on the other end, when it's initially created, create it this way, right? I don't know if that makes sense, but hopefully it does. And so the way that I could do that, I suppose there's a couple different ways I could do that. But basically, what I'm thinking is, when we create the debug element, we could just create what its type is there. And in fact, you can kind of see what we've been doing here. This is kind of interesting, which is that when we create a debug element, we just use whatever its actual, like whatever the event says that this thing is, that's what we do. And you can kind of see here we go like, oh, okay, get out a stored event, of this thing. And if we found a stored event, then you can render it. But one of the sort of nastinesses of that, and I think we can sort of see that if we come in here, right, is that if the stored event doesn't exist, you end up in this nasty scenario where you don't draw anything. And so what we would probably like to do is reverse a little bit the way this is working and see if we can maybe make it a little bit more based on the element. So for example, in here, I could say something like, let's grab the stored element out of this entirely. In fact, the stored event is really just not that relevant to pretty much any of this stuff, right? So if I were to do this, and then take a look at the only people who actually used the stored event, which is actually nobody, I think. Yeah, looks like nobody. In fact, I'm quite certain it's nobody at this point. So nobody actually uses that stored event. So from the element, right, we should be able to determine what its type is if we just copy that field up when we first see it. And then we could switch the type of an element anytime we wanted to, which would be nice for things where we want it to vary, right? So what I'm going to do here is say that in the debug element, which is, where did that go? That's not in here. That's in here. In the debug element itself, which is, who knows where? I don't know. Where did it go? Come on, there it is. In the debug element, I think what I'll do is put the type in here as well. I don't remember what this is even called. It's just called debug type. So when we actually create an element, I never find that function. Have you noticed how many times I've searched that function and I never find it? It's get element from event. That's what it's actually called. Get element from event. When we create one of these, which is here, whenever we do this push struct, all we would really have to do is say, well, whatever created it initially, we'll just make that be whatever type it is. And then I think we should be in pretty good shape, right? So this guy here, was drawing bitmaps, we haven't actually made this work again. What we will want to do is get the bitmap from the right frame. And so I think what we probably want to do there is this. Use the viewing frame ordinal would be my guess. Debug event to text. So here's the event. This uses the event, and then the bitmap uses the event. So those are the only people that do. Yeah. And I suppose what I could do too, now that I think about it, is I can just get that up here and leave it null. So I could say, you know, in here that we only draw this stuff if there's a valid bitmap, right? Similarly, I could say maybe something like none of these things really have to do with the bitmap, so I could actually do it this way as well if I wanted to. All right, so here I am getting my stored event. And what I want to do here is I want to use that most recent, viewing frame ordinal to get it. So the way I would do this is I just go, okay, the element frames, I get the viewing frame ordinal. And really this is like first stored event. So this is like most recent, or I guess this is most recent stored event, because there's multiple, right? There's multiple stored events for any given frame. So maybe I'll say like oldest stored event, something like that. And so now when I get that, I can choose to, if I want to, grab some other event or whatever, or I can choose to use that particular one. And in the case of the bitmap, I think it's fine to use that one, because if you output multiple bitmaps at the same place, I don't know that we want to show them all. We could loop over them if we wanted to. I'm not sure how much sense that really makes, or we could, I guess, stack them next to each other, but I don't know that we want to go through that trouble. Maybe we do? Because they could even be different sizes. It's quite a bit of work to go through and figure out how we would want to lay that out exactly, and I don't even know exactly what it would mean, right? And if there are more, do we need to scroll them? I don't know. It seems like that's a lot of UI work, a lot of UI system build out we'd have to do, which would all be useful if we did it in a sort of generic way that we could use for other things, but it's just probably not something we want to spend a lot of time building. We don't want some awesome UI system for the debug layer of this at the moment. So I think probably what I'll do is just say we've got this one here, and so we'll take the oldest stored event, and we'll just set that here. So if we have an oldest stored event, I assume that this is what we want, meaning the event portion of it. Otherwise, we don't want anything. And this. actually needs to be like that. That's code that's valid all the time. And our bitmap scale is also valid all the time. What is this? This is just goes out here. There we go. So now this doesn't really have to switch on this type anymore. This can switch on the element type. So we still want to probably do the same stuff because we're just gonna, you know, we're gonna go out to a different one, just only at this point. All the rest of the code can be the same. So let's go ahead and say that's the thread interval graph. Let's go ahead and say that this is debug type frame bar graph. And now we have sort of the code flow to switch between them. So all we need to do now is focus on making that actual button. This is the element. I've got too many things called element. It's a bad name, but you know, what else are you going to do? So, you know, what would we call this if we weren't going to call this? Maybe what I could do is call the layout elements something else. Let's see. What if I did this? Not the greatest name in the world, but and look, we already had this problem here, right? That's why we had to change that one's name. Let's see if that does any better. Oops. All right. This is not layout, that's element. So that looks all fine, and this here can do the same thing as we were doing before, whereas if we got one of these guys, we can lay it out. Oops, that's no good. There we go. Okay. And I guess this is a U8 and debug type, so we were saving space by putting that in a U8, so we got to cast it back out when we do it. So now my hope is that nothing changes here. Everything should be exactly the same, and it is, which is good. All that's good. I don't actually remember. Where was our... There's our entity. So this is kind of funny, like, right? We only display those on frames where there actually is one of these. And I guess, again, that's something we could, again, as we're making this sort of improvement here, we could fix that as well, right? Because we're only displaying them when there's actually data there, which leads to, like, sort of a flashing that happens. But we could actually always sort of display it by just making sure that we have an event that always works. Right? So we could say like debug event null event or something, right? Well, and to some degree, you know, even this probably we could upgrade considerably because our events now have multiple frames in them, and we could draw little graphs on them and all kinds of other weird stuff too, right? So that's kind of a separate issue. But anyway, if we have one of these here where we just have some kind of you know, just a null event thing that we're printing or whatever, what we could do is we could stuff the name of the event, right? We could stuff the GUID of the event, which is mostly what we're printing out, with whatever the elements GUID was. We could stuff the type with whatever the elements type is. And we could leave it at that. So that would mean that we can always pass an event, even if we didn't have one on that frame. It just wouldn't be a very good one, right? It just would be nothing there. But that's probably better. And this can also be basically made to do this now, since there is no case, let's see, where that's a problem. So let's run this and see. And so now that's much nicer, right? Now it just prints out zeros if it doesn't know what's going on instead of flashing, instead of like changing the layout here, which I think is, you know, strictly better to a certain extent. Because here's a frame, for example, where there's really no data at all. I'm not sure why that's still able to print something out in this case, because this is the collation frame. I guess we just happened to always have it. That's interesting. But anyway, I think that's better. So now I want to see if I can add some of these, some buttons in here. I want to add some buttons that'll do useful operations for us with our profiler. And so what I want to do is, I want to do something, I guess, that sets the element type to a new type. So I'm going to go ahead and create one of those. I don't really know, probably like debug interaction, set profile graph, or set element type, I guess is what it would be. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to make an interaction for these buttons. And what I'd like to do is just be able to kind of stack these buttons up in an easy fashion. So here is the stuff that does the begin layout rectangle for this other stuff. I want to kind of do something else where I maybe do like begin button row or something like this. End button row. I don't know if this should be, I'm not sure what, you know, what exactly I want this to be per se. But I'm just kind of sketching out what I probably want to type here. I want to be able to say I want a row of buttons that are going to do some stuff. And then I want to just be able to say, like, you know, layout button. And I want to be able to, like, just put in here whatever I want. So, you know, I want to be able to say, like, this particular thing is thread interval graph, or like, or you know what? This is probably a like an enum button or something, I guess. Yeah, like a state, like a Boolean button. I don't know what you want to call it, but this is a button that can basically be turned on, right? It's like, is this a thread interval graph or not? And so I'll call it threads for now because I don't know what else to call it. And then whether or not it's on is just if this element type equals the thread interval graph type. So basically I'm going to pass it like, I want a button, it's called threads. I want you to say if, you know, the element type is equal to thread interval graph. That says whether or not this is like highlighted, like it's on right now. If it was, so it's like true or false whether the button's on. And then I want to be able to do an interaction here where I create, you know, a debug in set element type interaction, and that's going to be for our debug ID, and we're going to set the element type to debug type thread interval graph. So that's just saying I want a button, I want it to be labeled threads, I want it to, you know, this to be the criteria as to whether or not it's highlighted, and then this is the action I want you to take in the case where it gets clicked. And then I want to be able to do this really easily, so I want to be able to make another one too, which just says like, okay, this is the frames version of this. This will show the frame bar graph, and same thing. So that seems like a pretty easy way to do buttons to me, and I like that, right? Pretty simple. We don't have any other settings at the moment, but I do have some other things that I said I wanted, right? I'd like to be able to go up in the hierarchy. And so I want something like an action button, which is up. And that action button would presumably do something like it would set the profile graph route, and it would set the profile graph route to like being above where we were. Now, this one's a little tricky. And the reason it's a little tricky is we don't record that piece of information, I don't think. I don't really remember, to be honest with you, but I don't think we do. So, for example, in our debug elements here, right, there's no such thing as like a parent. We can't like walk to our parent in any real case. And the other kind of nasty thing about that is in the profile, we don't really even necessarily know what that parent would be per se, because we don't know how we got here. There could be many ways to get to the same place that we're viewing in our profile, right? And so that's kind of a little confusing as well. Now, I mean, I suppose one thing we could do, and I don't know how I feel about this. I'm thinking to myself how I feel about it. One thing we could do is just do our rendering and allow ourselves to zoom. And then instead of like clicking on individual things, we would just zoom in on them. And then there's no concept of it's just a location in the profile space, which might be smarter. I don't know. But so let me just do something that I know we can do right now because I just want some way to get back. So let's just put a root button in. And so that's obvious what that's going to do, right? That would create an interaction that allows us to get directly back to the root layer. Oops. I think I just opened up the to-do list accidentally. I'm not really sure how I did it, but I did. So I'm going to go take a look at that in the draw profile stuff. When we do the draw profile, right, we were creating one of these interactions, and we sort of created it set profile graph root like so. And so I'm going to go back down here and make that happen. So I suppose what I could do is just do it like this. Say we've got a, zoom root. And now what we're going to say is, well, the element we want to set it to is none, right? We want to set it to 0. And so what I'm going to do there is just say, well, okay, that's the interaction for this guy. And then for these guys, where we are sort of creating them in line, and I guess we pretty much want to, well, I guess this is, yeah. What we want to be able to do is make this essentially a function, right? So we want there to be a debug interaction function that we can just call that right in line takes one of these, makes one of these and returns it, right? So it makes it makes one of these with whatever the debug idea is that we passed, and then it takes whatever the debug type is, and oops. Here we go. And just sort of sets that as a value that can be retrieved later. So I'm just going to go ahead and pull that out and make that be a little function that people can use here, like so. And then, oops, well, I got to rename this first. And then Just got to finish up. Yeah, the actual UI code. So that would specify all the information we need. So all we need to do now is actually make a way that these button interactions will actually, flow through the system. We've got to make, a thing that will lay them out and so on. So here is like our begin element rectangle and the sort of interaction stuff that we do for it and the end element and all that stuff. So what I want to do here is I want to sort of I want to make a new way in which these things might happen. And it occurs to me that probably I need to pass row in as I'm going here. Although, technically, I guess I wouldn't necessarily have to do that, because if I just pass layout all the time, that's probably all I actually really need, now that I think about it. Well, but, So, if I come through here, and I imagine that I'm going to be passing this, and I imagine that I've got, some kind of a layout row thing happening here. These aren't really going to pass anything. Excuse me. And since they're not custom rendered, I can do all the rendering inside these routines myself as well. So that basically anyone who wants to use the button system doesn't have to use any kind of rendering themselves. They can just make, their own buttons work. They can just say I want a button and know that they get it. So let me just finish speccing this out here. So we have a Boolean button, and this is the state, or highlighted. This is the name of the button, the name that's on the button. Same here. This is the interaction. The Boolean buttons also have an interaction when you click them. And I think that's really it. So now what I need to do, and you can kind of see the methodology that I'm going through here, right? I did what I always say that you should do. If you know what the usage code is going to look like, you just write it first. And that's exactly what I did. I was like, what do I actually want this to look like? And I wrote it out. Snuffleupagus-oriented programming, as I think I called it before. You just have an imaginary, you imagine you have some system that's going to do what you want. You code to that system, and then you see what the API looks like if you just imagined you had it. That's what I did. And now I'm going to go actually type in the code for that system and reverse engineer what actual other information and structs I need to make that happen. And again, this sort of gets at this thing I was talking about yesterday when I was talking about how I don't think object-oriented programming is ever useful. It's because I never do it, right? I never actually do that. Objects will automatically appear when you follow good procedural programming and other sorts of techniques. The objects just make themselves. You don't have to think about them. They just occur. They're a byproduct of a correctly functioning system that should never be the starting point and never be a focus. It should just be incidental, right? And that's exactly what I'm going to have happen here. I'm going to take a look at what I need to actually fulfill the requirements that the UI code wanted to have happen here. And that will tell me what I need to actually store. And that's all there is to it. So anyway, here we go. I know that I can't draw a row of buttons, perhaps, until after I know how many buttons there are, maybe. In this case, I guess that's not really true. Normally if I wanted to fill a specific width, that would be true, because then I'd have to divide by the number of buttons that there are. But in this case, I don't know that I really need to do that, because I'm just kind of going to stack buttons up along the way. I may not really need to do that. Now, it's possible that I still should, but just thinking about it, I guess I don't really have to. So when I come in here and do an action button, really, I guess all I need to do is lean on the existing element system to make that element occur, right? So what I can do is do exactly this stuff. I can say, I want an action button. I'm going to begin an element rectangle for it. I need this, obviously, to have the layout system in some way. Now, whether it's a parameter or whether it gets passed down in some other thing as part of the row situation, I don't know at the moment, but we'll see. So I'm going to go ahead and say that I get the layout there. I need the dimensions. The dimension can come from me figuring out how big this text rectangle is. So I have a basic text element thing here, and you can kind of see that really all I need to do is the code for this thing. Now I don't know that I really want to use this explicitly though, because I believe that I want to do my own kind of custom drawing and stuff here. But for the most part, this code will be fairly similar. So I'm going to start with that, but then I'm going to make it a bit different. And it's possible that maybe, well, you know what I could do too? I could just expand this function, right? What I could do is say, well, there's basic text element, and that's going to actually maybe come up here, become more of a first-class citizen as in the way that it works, right? So let's put that up here. Here's basic text element. That does all the stuff that we need, except putting maybe a box around the thing. But even that we don't necessarily need at the moment. So we'll just hold off on this for 1 second and say, well, okay, we could just call basic text element. We know what the interaction is, right? And we know that we've got, excuse me, the layout and the text that it needs. So that's a pretty good start for making an action button, right? But the problem that we have is in end element. So we want a row of buttons, but in end element, every time an element is finished, we're going to advance to the next line. You can see that happening here, right? So what happens is as this thing sort of draws itself, we have this spacing Y situation happening. And so what I think we want to do instead here is introduce into our layout system the concept that we don't always want an automatic sort of carriage return as we're stacking up rows. And so what we could do is say, all right, let's get rid of that. So when we do begin, we could even say begin row and end row, since it doesn't have anything to do with buttons now. We could do begin row and end row, and what that could say is, all right, the layout system is now going to go into a wrapping mode or something like this, like auto line feed or no line feed equals true, right? And then in here no line feed, or maybe if we're being sort of amusing ourselves and we want to support nesting these together, we could do that. So we do begin row and we do end row. We're just going to say that there's going to be no line feeds happening now. And then what we would do is say, all right, when we make an action button, we just make a basic text element. And maybe when we make a Boolean button for now, we do exactly the same thing. And then we don't even really need the concept that rows even return anything, right? We don't even need, that's not even necessary. So we just do this and we're basically done, right? There's nothing weird going on there. So we could also now have a highlight for the time being that says, well, let's draw these things in two different ways depending on the circumstances. So we could do that as well. And the other thing that I can do now is I can go implement that no line feed concept, which I believe we have to start in here by adding to our layout system. Wherever that even is, I don't even know where that is. Struct layout. So these never really made it over here, did they? Let's get those out there. Let's get those into the H file. There we go. So what I want to do now is in these layouts, I want to have an incrementer, which is essentially just the no line feed counter. And so then I guess got to come back here and port this code to the new thing that I've decided it needs to be, which is it doesn't need to do that sort of return value stuff there, but it needs to pass the layout everywhere. We also decided that it's really just begin row and end row. And there we go. So now let's just finish up by implementing that no line feed thing. I'm going to first see what happens when I run it, just so you can kind of see what I'm talking about here. So here's our profile. And you can kind of see that we've got these values getting printed out here. Well, so going back to the root is a little trickier than we thought. This might want to try to say null, in which, oh, well, wait, can we set it to the root? We can set it to the root, though, but I suppose I'll just allow it anyway. So setting the GUID to 0 allows us to go back to the root. Got to go fix that OpenGL texture submission stuff. All right. So now we can go back to the root to our heart's content, but we can't click on these two for some reason, and I'm not sure. Oh, I am sure why. We've never implemented that case. We might as well implement that case while we're down here, right? So in nInteract, if we're in debug interaction, set element type, then all we should have to do is just say that whatever element we are ostensibly interacting with in this case. Although, it's actually this. Am I right? Where's our debug interaction? Yeah, so it's a little janky because we can't store, we wouldn't be able to store the way that we've done this. You can't store like multiple parameters to an interaction right now, which is kind of lame. Because we want to be able to store both the element and the type that we want to set that element to, if that makes sense. And so really we want this to be a little bit more expansive, right? We don't really want this to be as constrained, if that makes sense. Like I want to be able to do that, which I suppose I can just do, if that makes sense. Not really much of a reason why I couldn't do that. And so if I was to do that, I can just set whatever I want. I can just say I want to set this element to this type and be done with it. Excuse me. Let me take a look here. And see. So yeah, this checks for IDs. It checks for the types. And then it checks to see if the, so this would also now just check to see if the elements were equal as well. And anytime someone was going to make one of these, it's already basically clearing that out. So when I do a set element type interaction, really all I need to do now is just say that, well, you have to tell me what element you actually meant as well. Because that way you can basically create a generic command that can set any element's type regardless of who's doing it or when, which seems better to me. And there's no reason not to do it. I mean, we're essentially sort of making a little lambda, right? A like poor man's closure to do what it is that we want to do when we set that. Of course, it doesn't work, which is also good. But that's because, again, I didn't implement it. So yeah, so in this case, we should just be able to say, well, I want whatever my element is, I want its type to become whatever the parameter was. And that's, I think, it. And of course I have to cast that, but I guess I could even do this. Because why not? Oops. All right. And so that should be that. All right. So now we can switch between these two pretty straightforwardly, right? But like I was saying, they're not really like, we don't want to take up lines for a button. And so that I want to implement the row sort of wrapping situation a little bit differently, so it's easy for us to kind of switch in that way. So doing that is really straightforward. Like I said, we kind of already set it up so that the layout system knows which way it's in by looking at that no line feed variable. So all we have to do is take a look at our code here that does our advancing after each layout element and just say, well, okay, if we're in a no line feed mode, then we're going to advance the X. Otherwise, we clear and advance the Y. So in this case, where we have the return happening, I suppose the other thing we need to do is pull this out into sort of a separate thing, and I'll show you why in a second. Well, I take that back. Yeah. So what I want to do is I want to be able to pass the dimension here to advance by, like so. And that way I can call it after the row is over, because if I otherwise we'll get it so that it won't advance after it won't go back, it won't do the carriage return, it'll print the graph and then do the carriage return, which is not what we want. So I need a way of calling advance element when you end a row as well. So I'm going to call advance element here with total bounds, which will do sort of what it has been doing. And then when we need to do an end row, I'll just call advance element, and I'll just pass it no bounds at all. And so, and well, not quite no bounds at all. So that's actually a rectangle, right? And so what I need to do here is just create a rectangle that essentially doesn't have any bounds. So it would be the rectangle at the current location, which is rectangle min max. Sorry, rectangle 2. Don't know why I put layout element there. All right. Now this isn't quite right yet, and I guess we'll see that in a second, and then we'll fix it and kind of move forwards. But anyway, so if we have no line feed, then what we want to do is just move the layout at X rather than the layout at Y. So the layout at Y would stay the same, and what we'd want to do is get the max corner of the X and add the spacing X to it, right? And we don't have a current concept of spacing X, I don't think. Or do we? I don't actually know where these things come from. Oh, they just come from the layout. So I don't know if we have a spacing X. I don't even know what that is supposed to be. So I'm going to go ahead and change this around a little bit. There we go. So we haven't defined a spacing x yet, which is a problem. So we're going to have to make one of those, and that's again whatever we want that spacing to be. But that's pretty easy. So we can just do spacing x here. And then whenever we define spacing y, we can define spacing x. And I don't know what it should be. I don't really care. We can always adjust it. So that's about that. Now, when we actually create this, and in fact, I guess that's sort of what you can see down here. When we create this initially, we also have a slight problem, which is that this layout doesn't actually know what its original x baseline is. So if you take a look in here, where we've got sort of this layout and we've got this at parameter, really we kind of want that to be an offset in some way, or we want to track the two values separately, right? And there's there's equivalent ways that we could do that. So what I think we should probably do is say there's like a base corner or something like this, and an at, I don't know, something like that. Or we can set a left margin, anything like this. To be honest with you, I'm not really sure how we were processing depth properly. I guess we just increment by depth automatically as we kind of go. But anyway, point being, I'm just going to set this so we know what our left margin was. And that's important because in order to line feed, that's the only way we're going to be able to get back to it, if that makes sense. So let's see here. In this case, I'm just going to set this to base corner x. Don't really know. Okay, there we go. Because I don't really know what that function's called. All right. So first things first, just make sure everything's still working properly, and it appears to be, so that's all good. And then you can see we're already a little closer to correct because now these are at least on the same line, but we still have some more stuff that's not correct about them. So the first thing is the one that I was talking about before, which is you notice how it doesn't, that carriage return is not quite the correct thing. And the reason for that is because we haven't tracked what the lowest point in y is on that line. So this code here, remember I mentioned this, right? This code here is not going to be correct anymore because get min quarter dim y, we were previously using that value because we knew we were just rendering one thing and then going to the next line. We knew that the only thing we need to know was how low that thing went. But now if we're going to stock up many things on a row, we essentially need to keep track of what the lowest thing actually was. So in advanced element, we always have to do something here, which is going to say that like the layout next y base or something like this, right? Next y line is going to have to equal whatever the minimum value was of our current best one and the one that we, are sort of using, are seeing now. And then when we come through here and we're going to set our y layout, we want to set that to be whatever that next y line was, regardless of what the current element that we're advancing for is. And then when we're done with that, we want to clear that next y line out so we don't have to worry about it, right? Now we'd also probably like this to be 0. So rather than looking at it this way, what I'd probably say is, well, let's take a look at what our at y is, right? And say, what is the difference between these two? So if you were to try to go to the min corner from where we were, how far would that be, right? Like, what's the delta, if that makes sense? And then we just keep, that, and this is really like next y delta or something. Does that make sense? That way init to 0 still works for this guy. And so when we get this next y line, then what we'd say is like, oh, okay. It's actually just going to add to wherever we currently were. We'll add whatever that delta is, and then we'll be in good shape. And when we clear it, we'll just clear it to 0. easy peasy lemon squeezy, as Jeff likes to say. And so now we've just got another thing in here, which is R32 next y line. And that should now check that, oh, whoops, next y delta. Okay. So now when you take a look, you can see that now we actually have these properly leaving the space that you would have expected them to leave, you know, before this guy comes in. And we can toggle these guys nicely and all that stuff works, but unfortunately we don't really have spacing here that makes a whole lot of sense. And so what we want to do is take a look with our sort of with our text element stuff here, where we're doing advanced element on the total bounds and figure out why our total bounds is advancing so much more than it should. Now, I'm not certain. This is not really dim. This is like the element rect. First of all, I'm pretty sure. So let's name that a little clearer so that it's not confusing. So the thing that I'm not sure about is this seems like it should be correct. Like whatever the maximum corner was of the thing that we were using is where we would be now. And so I think the problem, I suspect, is that we have our depth value, like our indentation value, is kind of janky, right? We're taking this indent, and I think we're implying that indent each time here, right? Because that indent's like baked in. And so what we really want to do is we really want to make it so that the indent only happens on advance. So that depth, wherever that is actually happening, which I assume is in here somewhere. So there it is. When you look at total min corner, you can see this nonsense happening, right? And what we really want to do is say that's not something we actually want in here. That's something we want to do when we actually do our line advance. So when we do advance element, in here is really the part. And so when we go back to the base corner, then we would do this sort of addition based on the depth. So now that seems a little more reasonable. Of course, we wouldn't handle the very first one properly, which you can see here. Although I don't know why the depth is considered to be non-zero through here. That's a little bit weird. But now these things are tightly packed, which is what we would expect. Now maybe we want to make a little bit of space between them so we can see the difference between them, but that's our prerogative now rather than something that's required, which we don't actually want. So yeah, getting a little better. This could stand to be cleaned up a little bit, but definitely getting a little bit better. Now, the other thing that we probably want to do is take a look at basic text element situation here and say that we want this to be a little bit probably cleaner, or a little bit more responsive, I guess is what I should say. So we know whether this interaction is hot. Where is is it this way? I don't really remember how we do this. Does that seem right? Is hot. Interaction is hot. That's what I wanted. So what I really want to say, I guess, is hot equals interaction is hot. Okay. So if I know that this is hot, then what I could do is say there's an item color and a hot color, right? And I suppose the person who's calling me could also do that, but I think it's a little bit more interesting if that's just passed in here. And maybe by default, this actually does do that. So maybe by default, you know, it's this sort of a thing. And then I can just say, well, if it's hot, then we use the item, so then we use the hot color, otherwise we use the item color. And that seems good. So then, we'd get a little bit of highlighting here, which is good. These don't really have interactions, so I should probably make it so that hot interactions are a little less highlighty there, because I assume that interaction is a null interaction. So I think probably, and I don't even know, like, I feel like that should probably be something that we check for. So I feel like saying interactions are equal, we should possibly also say, if the interaction that we're talking about is not real. So interaction type. If there isn't an interaction, then it can't be hot. Oops. Right? Because you can only really be a hot interaction if there is an interaction at all. So at that point, it's like, it makes a little more sense. Of course, for some reason, again, that didn't seem to actually change it, which it should, right? I mean, that should be failing the isHot test, because anything that's a null interaction shouldn't actually work. What am I missing there? Oh, I know what I'm missing. Those are probably set to auto. That's a little tricky. Since those are set to auto, we don't know whether they're going to have an interaction or not. It's an interesting dilemma. Anyway, I'll end it there because we did what we wanted to do, and we've got a little more work to do, but it's a good place to stop. So we'll take about 10 minutes of Q&A. And by the way, lemon in tea is like the total right thing to put in tea. I'm not sure why there's even a discussion about that. It's way better. Tea with lemon is awesome. It's way better than tea with milk. Cuber Caleb, not a serious question. Why not just import npm and use leftpad to indent the strings? That is a very good point. Certainly that would have led to increased robustness for Handmade Hero. Isaac, I think you were selecting the ground as an entity. Is that bad for some reason? Pseudonym 73 posted a PDF. What does the PDF say? Oh, cool. Arc length parameterization of spline curves. That's kind of fun. So it tries to reparameterize the spline so that its distance is constant. That's pretty cool. I don't really have time to read this all right now, but I'm just kind of skimming it. So it's basically just an iterative subdivider that attempts to produce a constant parameterization set of splines from one that's non. which seems like a totally reasonable approach, right? Sean McGrath, you know how if you add one letter to HAL, you get IBM? Did you know if you add one letter to VMS, you get Windows NT? Yes, I did know that. I don't know if that's why they did it, but I did know, I have heard that sort of urban legend at least. Jesse Meyer, so this interface system is a very simple immediate mode design. Not really. You could do a much simpler one if you wanted to. We use interaction storing, which means that we don't have a frame of latency when you interact with the system. We do have a frame of latency when you for highlighting, but not for interaction, if that makes sense. So you could actually do a much simpler kind of immediate mode structure, which just does the if and the action right in line, if that makes sense. PMAT2, why are there some blue lines outside the profile window sometimes? So those are, remember, normally we've got this guy, which shows all the threads separately, if that makes sense. And so if you have a really long thread that's like doing asset loading that takes multiple, that, you know, exists across a frame boundary, you wouldn't really notice that because it only flashes for a second. In here, if you have a long asset load that takes a long time, you could start an asset load in this frame and have it last into the other frame because it's on a separate thread. So that thread has no notion of frames and doesn't care about frames at all. It just started and was doing its thing. So you can easily go outside the profile window. We don't make any attempt to stop that. And I'm not sure I want to stop it because it's correct in that sense. Since this is debug view, I don't care really how pretty it is. And that is what actually happened. It started in this frame and went, you know, to the next frame. And I don't really have much of a plan for if I don't have a thing in mind where I'm like, how would I like to see that, you know? Dude, in Basement 1, Visual Studio 2015, you can use Clang as a compiler. Can you, though? I mean, I don't think you can, because it obviously doesn't handle declspec in trin, so declspec in trin type. So it can't compile actual Windows declarations, so I'm not sure how it would work, unless I'm missing something. Are you using Clang CL? Yes, I was. All right, so any other questions? Does not look like it. Jesse Meyer, you were mentioning before about objects arising as a natural consequence of properly engineered code as the system requires, but you do not mean a C++ object, so what do you mean as an object? Well, so an object is obviously a nebulous term. But to give you an example, let's say we have this thing here, right? So Handmade render group is basically like a system that we use that does our rendering, right? It's how our rendering gets buffered and processed. And at no time during the development of this did we sit down and go, let's think about what the structs are going to be, because that's really important. Or what functions go with which structs. Because it's irrelevant to programming. It literally is completely irrelevant. It's not a thing that you ever have to think about for any reason. So what I mean by the objects fall out of it is when you actually just focus on what the code actually has to do, you just find out by what you wrote and what it had to do, what needs to get stored where. We know that object transform and render group are two different things because we found that out when we wrote the code. It was just much better when we separated this piece of information out as something that could be talked about separate from this one, right? And that's so crucial. That's the core thing I mean when I say that object-oriented programming is a bad idea. You never think about objects. They are not a thing that you conceptualize in your head if you're programming properly. I literally have never seen anyone do programming that I thought was good with that mentality. What you do is you focus on what the code actually has to accomplish, and then you find out how the data is bundled automatically from what you had to do, what pieces the algorithms actually had to draw from. And that is crucial. So it doesn't even really matter to me what you want to call an object. Those are the critical things. What data gets bundled together semantically, which are our structs, and what do our functions actually do, right? Which are, which is the actual content of the code. That is the entirety of the determination of the architecture of the system. And you come at that by figuring out what the code needs to do and figuring out what data needs to be bundled in, what the most efficient bundling of the data is to make those functions work the way they need to work and the people who call them be able to use them the way that they want. And that's the end of it. So if at any time you switch your focus over to something of the form, well, a render entry bitmap really, like people who use a render entry bitmap should not know that there's some members of this thing and I've got to make sort of a private way of making render entry bitmaps that only some people can do. And you start creating this concept that the object is somehow an important thing and I need to start focusing on properties of the object is just a very inefficient and error-prone method of architecting your system, and it does not result in good systems. So typically, if you want to go from a state like we have in Handmade Hero, where we're making the code and we're going fairly efficiently along, but we're not stopping to make any of these things like bulletproof or reusable. We're not trying to ship a sort of a standalone system using any of these particular components. And people ask me this question all the time, does this change with larger teams or all this other nonsense? And the answer is always no, it doesn't. It's the same thing. What you do if you want to start making this code into something that's more reusable, more library-like, that can be shared out to multiple people without causing problems and so on, you don't do anything differently than what I just did. All you do is you start moving code out of the H file into the CPP file, and you only put in the H file the things that they need to see. That's all you do. That's it. That's the end of it. because then they're not bothered with, like, maybe they don't need to know what a render entry rectangle is, so we just move it out of the H file. End of the story, right? And they just see this, instead of this. And now they don't have that thing's opaque to them. They don't go looking in it. They know they're not really supposed to unless it's something important, where they would go digging into your code, right? And we take only the functions from here that we have thought about and made sure we define the functions to work exactly as they should. And we take that and we put those functions in the H file. That is how you ship good architectures that are easy to use, that last a long time, et cetera, et cetera. There is no other part of it. There's nothing else about it, if that makes sense. You have a typo in the comment for object transform. That's probably true. You probably have a lot of typos in a lot of things. There is no typo, actually, in that particular case. Yeah, just to be clear, thang is intentional. Like its own thing. Sometimes there's just an accent, Sometimes you're going to move this out to its own thing, but other times you're going to move this out to its own thing. That's just how that is. All right, I'm going to close it down. There are unsaved changes. Well, I guess I changed this. What did I change? Oh, right. I didn't really change anything. I was just sort of typing while I was complaining about how people shouldn't use object-oriented programming. All right. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in for another episode of Handmade Hero. If you would like to follow along at home with the source code, you can always pre-order the game on handmadehero.org. It comes with the source code that I update every night, so you can be up to date. We also have a forum you can go to answer questions. Hopefully a forum that will soon get a facelift due to the impending release of Handmade Network, which I believe is happening later this month. There's also a Patreon page you can go to if you want to support the video series, and a tweet bot, which I will have to go start now. As we talked about in the pre-stream, anytime they reboot my server, I have not actually gone and figured out how I put things in the startup sequence in this particular flavor of Unix. So every time they reboot my server, I have to go manually restart the tweetbot, which is probably not what I should be doing. I should find out where the actual startup sequence is and put it in there. But Unix, there's probably 50,000 places it could be, depending on the particular release of the particular distribution. So you know how it is. Anyway, that's about it. I'll be back here tomorrow, 5 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. Hope to see you back here. Seems like we're getting pretty far along on the debug code, so I feel like we should be kind of being able to bolt everything up relatively soon here. I mean, it feels like things are kind of converging. We're adding some nice features, and stuff feels pretty good. So it kind of seems like we'll be able to wrap that up this week, maybe, and move on to some of the other items on our to-do list. Until tomorrow, I hope you have some other programming that you might be doing, and I hope it goes well. If not, well, there's always tomorrow. So take it easy, everyone, and I will see you back here. Until then, have fun programming. I'll see you on the internet. Take it easy.